There's a good chance you're dealing with a middleman, like me, when you get your medicines. That's because PBMs and insurers are often the same company. We even own big chain pharmacies and are buying your doctor's office. We decide what medicines you can get, where you get them, and how much you pay. It's a win-win. For me.
When middlemen own it all, you lose. Visit phrma.org/middlemen to learn more. Paid for by Pharma.
Every day, thousands of Comcast engineers and technologists, like Kunle, put people at the heart of everything they create.
In the average household, there are dozens of connected devices. Here in the Comcast family, we're building an integrated in-home Wi-Fi solution for millions of families like my own. It brings people together in meaningful ways.
Kunle and his team are building a Wi-Fi experience that connects 1 billion devices every year. Learn more about how Comcast is redefining the future of connectivity at comcastcorporation.com/Wi-Fi.
Hello, Beat Check listeners. I'm Shane Dixon Kavanaugh, Portland City Hall reporter for the Oregonian OregonLive, and your host today. It is a bleak time for mass transit all throughout the U.S. The challenges here in the Portland metro area are many and pronounced. TriMet is providing about 30 million fewer rides each year than it did in 2019, and the recovery appears to be slowing way down. Rider safety has been a persistent concern since the pandemic. Fare evasion is rampant. Meanwhile, TriMet's subsidy per ride has soared by more than 400% in the last decade, and the Regional Transit Agency is now raising the prospect of staggering service cuts over the next few years. Joining me today to talk a bit about this perilous moment for public transit in the Portland region is Mike Rogoway, business reporter for the Oregonian OregonLive. Mike, thanks so much for being here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Shane.
Well, let's just start with stating a few obvious things around why a healthy mass transit system arguably is pretty important for any major metropolitan area, including the Portland metro area. First of all, tens of thousands of people in this region depend on public transit to get around, whether it's to their jobs, to appointments, to family things on a daily basis. Without a really robust mass transit system, we're dealing with even worse traffic congestion than we already face. And in turn, that creates sort of a greater and more harmful environmental impact on the region. What else am I missing here?
Well, you said it, Shane. I mean, it's a very efficient way to move people. On light rail, you've moved them off the roads altogether. On buses, you're packing, 20, 30, or in those new FX2 buses, 50, 60 people into one bus. It's a much more efficient way to move people around the roads. And a lot of people, if you can't afford a car, if you can't afford insurance, if you can't afford gas every day, this is a much more affordable way to get around the city. And I think everywhere on Earth where there is a dense concentration of people, public transit is important to get them from place to place.
And historically, Portlanders have really celebrated and championed mass transit and TriMet. I mean, we even have a Portland streetcar, for heaven's sakes. I mean, this is a really important feature to sort of urban life here in this town. And yet we have seen a really dramatic drop-off of people using TriMet on an annual basis. This had occurred all over the country at the beginning of the pandemic. And yet we're also seeing a very kind of dramatic slowdown of people returning to use public transit here in Portland. And you wrote about this recently, and this is why I wanted to talk with you a bit more. But so what can you tell us about that, Mike?
Well, let me start by prefacing this, Shane. I'm not the transportation reporter. I cover the economy. I also cover technology. And I wanted to look at TriMet's ridership because of the broader economic story it tells that you were alluding to. And yes, a transportation ridership fell everywhere after the pandemic, and it hasn't in almost everywhere. It hasn't come back to where it used to be. And as with many things in Portland in the pandemic, the fall was harder here, and the recovery was both slower and less complete. And so we went from 100 million rides a year before the pandemic down to 40 million in the 2020-2021 fiscal year. That's the heart of the pandemic. And we've recovered some of that. We're 66 million. But as you said at the beginning of your introduction, that's 30 million fewer rides a year than we had at in the pre-pandemic times. And TriMet says that the big reason for that is changing work patterns. Oregon is one of the top work from home states. It was that way before the pandemic. It's even more so after the pandemic. People were commuting downtown, and the bus, the light rail, the streetcar was a way to do it. You and I work downtown. We know that there are far fewer people around us when we're here. The pickup, the recovery in foot traffic downtown has slowed. The recovery in TriMet's ridership has slowed. It started to bounce back pretty quickly after the pandemic. It's only up on pace, to be up about 5% or something like that this year. So the long story short, we're not going to get back to where we were anytime soon, if ever. And so that presents a structural challenge for TriMet.
Now, perhaps, I'm often getting out of downtown Portland at the end of the workday, and I would say it's probably a little easier to get out of the central city than it was pre-pandemic. But looking at the region as a whole, even with a huge number of people still working from home, traffic congestion in the Portland metro area hasn't really improved that much. And I've just found that so interesting that we are, even if people are working from home, the sort of traffic patterns overall and traffic congestion just has not improved noticeably.
Yeah, it's a paradox that there would be fewer people commuting to work, and at the same time, traffic would be just about as bad as ever. And there's the big explanation for that is a lot of the traffic on the road isn't commuters. It's people, getting from, other places to other places, or it's goods and products moving around. And so that's the best explanation for the paradox. I'm just looking up here, Shane. I cited a separate study a couple years ago, 2023 traffic among West Coast cities. Portlanders lose 38 hours to traffic a year in commuting, in traffic congestion. So it's still pretty severe, but public transportation doesn't address a lot of the reason people are on the road, and it's not necessarily an easy way around that.
And one of the things that you and I were talking about earlier this week in the newsroom, and looking at sort of the ridership data with TriMet, and that even though we've seen the precipitous drop beginning in the pandemic in 2020, you and I both sort of noted that ridership on TriMet reached its peak well before then. It was in 2012. And then similarly, that got us talking about how bike ridership in Portland also peaked roughly around the same time. I looked this up. So it was 2014 and 2015 that we had sort of the high watermark for bike commuting in Portland. So it's kind of interesting that we saw both sort of the public transit use and bike commuting sort of reach the high watermark well before the pandemic here in Portland. And both are still struggling to recover, and quite possibly won't ever get back to those numbers that we saw in 2012 to 2014.
Yeah, I think we're speculating to some degree about what's going on there, but I think we would know one correlation we might observe is that there was an influx of population to the region in the years after the Great Recession and before the pandemic. And it could be that the people who were coming to Portland in that period were coming here for reasons other than the reasons people came in the years before. You said at the beginning of our conversation just how central public transportation was to the city's identity. And I think bicycling was the same way. I mean, relatively few people bike commute in Portland, but those who do are very dedicated to it. But in the years after the pandemic, we were drawing people because we were adding jobs at a crisp pace. Incomes were growing in the region, and we were still, compared to other West Coast cities, a relatively affordable place to live. And those are, jobs and affordability are not necessarily correlated with, public transit or bike riding. Maybe bringing people in who had different cultural values than the people who were here before. It may not have been a radical difference, but on the margins, it mattered and might help explain why those things peaked. Also, if we're getting more affluent, and we are, people can maybe better afford to drive, and it can be more convenient.
Yeah, for better or for worse.
And we also have to note the rise of ride hailing, Uber and Lyft, and it's much easier to get around than when you had to call up a cab and wait for it. Well, now you just call it up on your phone, summon it, it'll be there in 5 minutes, and you can go where you want. Again, that's more expensive, a lot more expensive in most cases than taking public transit, but it's pretty convenient.
It's true. One of the other things that you and I have sort of touched on and looked at periodically over the last few years, and as have some of our colleagues in the newsroom, specifically regarding TriMet and just sort of ridership experience in general, has been around this safety issue. And it would be tough to argue that perceptions of ridership, of safety on public transit hasn't sort of depressed the number of people who are using it post-pandemic, and perhaps for a good reason. Immediately following the pandemic, we did have this explosion of public drug use around Portland, and that included on buses and MAX trains. I mean, this was a persistent problem and challenge. Behavioral health, mental health, addiction issues were, showing up on buses and trains as well. And, and at the same time, there was a period where there wasn't sort of a heightened security presence, or just the overall feeling that the city wasn't feeling safe, and neither was public transit for that matter. And so, I think that being sort of a through line over the last 4 or 5 years has certainly had an impact as well.
I think you're right on there. Now, we should be clear, that the odds of something nefarious happening to you on TriMet are relatively low. I mean, they're quite low. But if it doesn't feel good, then that will affect ridership. And so if you see somebody using drugs on the streetcar or on the bus, and I imagine you and I have both seen that many, many, many times, it might be it might not directly impact you, but it doesn't feel safe. And TriMet has asked people about this, and they did a survey last fall and found nearly half of respondents said safety concerns had deterred them from riding MAX at least sometimes. And so that's impacting ridership. This was something we learned early in our coverage of downtown, for example, after the pandemic, is that perceptions matter. That really influences people's behavior. And so we had this high rise in homicides in Portland, far higher than other West Coast cities, and it was much more persistent than other West Coast cities. And still, your odds of being a victim of a homicide were relatively low, in fact, extremely low. But the fact that there were, 3 times as many as before the pandemic affects people's perception of safety. And that affects people's behavior, and affects people's willingness to come downtown or ride TriMet or things like that. Even if it's, by most measures safe, if it doesn't feel safe, that will affect ridership. And TriMet has taken steps to address this. And
I wouldn't just say steps, but dramatic steps. And they've poured a substantial amount of money into boosting, security presence on buses and trains, also at stations and stops.
Yes.
I mean, I don't know if how recently you've been on public transit, or if you're taking the MAX or the bus much these days, Mike. I still do quite a bit. And sometimes it's striking. Like you can be out, one of the max lines that I'm often getting on is at 82nd and Halsey. It's not too far away from my house. And, sometimes you'll be out on the train platform and there'll be literally like 5 or 6 security guards just on that platform. They'll get on a train, they'll do some patrols and things like that. But I mean, TriMet has certainly responded to this, concern around safety, at least with heightened security presence, and also greater partnerships too with the Multnomah County Sheriff's Office, the Portland Police Bureau, and then the DA's office too.
I think it comes back to that perception issue, Shane. In this case, TriMet's trying to make it work for it. If there is a visible security presence, people may feel safer and feel more inclined to ride. Also, people who might, have other motives for what they're doing that day, they may feel less inclined to ride TriMet if it's clear that there's security there. I think you don't have to have somebody on every single train and every single bus to start to improve the perception and the feel of things.
Yeah, well, though one observation that I just sort of wanted to share as somebody who, has continued to be a public transit user, I drive a car. I take the bus and the Max. I bike around town quite a lot too. And Mike, you're a bike commuter as well. But I think it is important to note, and we've sort of have seen this with sort of perceptions of like downtown Portland too, is that for people who actually don't go to downtown Portland, they still think it's like the height of 2020 or the immediate aftermath. And I think similarly, public transit was pretty bad and gnarly for a period of time here. I just don't think you can argue otherwise. And yet, in 2025, we're nowhere near what we were in 2022 or 2023. So I don't know. Maybe this is just me sharing my own sort of personal perspective and experience, but I think it's an important one for folks to listen to and hear that. There's always the potential and possibility that there could be some problematic, behaviors or people, getting on a Max train or a bus. But the situation is just dramatically different than it was than even a couple of years ago.
It's a very important point. Perceptions take a while to change. And I think that's something else that when we've talked to behavioral economists and economists about the lingering effects of the pandemic in the Portland area, perception has been part of the issue. But the reality, as you say, and I don't have stats on crime on TriMet, but we've seen the stats on crime overall. And although crime was stubbornly high in the Portland area in the years after the pandemic, the improvement over the last 18 months has been considerable. And in many respects, we're getting back to where we were in 2019, which is a region of relatively low violent crime. And compared to the nation as a whole. And so I think by and large, you can feel safe on TriMet on most of the routes. And, I as you say, I'm a bike commuter. I used to be a almost daily TriMet rider. I'm far less so now, but I've certainly observed what you've seen is that on certain Max stops, there'll be quite a few people, and it's not uncommon at all to see a security person on TriMet on the Max.
Yeah, but and I was also just reminded a few weeks ago of just actually, even with all of the challenges and some of the, we already have been some service cuts and reductions to TriMet in the last few years, and there could be some really significant ones approaching in the future, and we'll talk about that in a moment too. But my family and I went down to visit relatives in Southern California a few weeks ago, and we decided to take the Max at the airport to the 72 bus on 82nd to get ourselves home. But it was incredibly convenient. It was a real pleasant experience overall. And I don't know, even with two relatively small kids, my kids are getting older now, they still think like riding on the Max train's super fun and kind of special. And I don't know, I again, it's a personal thing. I always just love it. It is just such a great cross section of just sort of people that you can meet riding the Max or riding the bus. I mean, we had a bunch of conversations with strangers. It was lovely. People wish us a good day when we're getting off. I don't know. I mean, I just think it's important to just sort of, keep that in mind, especially when we're, faced with potentially sort of an existential threat for TriMet right now.
Having a convenient and dependable ride to the airport, which TriMet is extremely useful. I've done it many times, and we have, as I say, 66 million rides a year. There's this spider web of routes throughout the city. It is part of Portland's identity. It's fairly easy to get from one place to another on public transit, and often very fast.
Yeah. I mean, so I think the other thing, before we move on, I will also just say, I'm not trying to paint just like a totally rosy golden picture of riding public transit in Portland. I mean, certainly it still has issues. Portland still has issues. We're working through those. But like things are, I would argue overall, whether it's anecdotally or in the data itself, things appear to be improving citywide. And I would say, and I would argue on public transit as well. Having said that, getting back to the numbers here, that high watermark, Mike, in 2012, we're talking over 100 million riders. And we're now down to 66 million. I mean, that's a massive drop off. And that has a huge, it has a huge public impact as well, even if you're not a public transit user. And that's just around the subsidy that TriMet has to pay to keep its current service going. And I think if you have those numbers in front of you, you can just sort of go over them. I mean, this was one of the pieces of your, of your recent story that just really blew my mind, is how much more the public subsidy is for a ride on TriMet today than it was 10 years ago.
Yeah, so TriMet calculates, and they always have, and they publish this. It's very accessible, very easy to find on their website. The difference between what you pay for your ticket, which I think is $280 a ticket right now for a single ride, versus what it costs them to offer that ride. And we'll go back to the high water mark you were talking about, early in the last decade. And they were putting an additional, and by they I mean we, the taxpayers primarily, we're putting an extra $1.70, $1.80 into the ride to cover the cost of that. And that started to rise in 2017, 2018. It was going up rather sharply, and part of that reflected the decision by TriMet to expand ridership and make it more accessible to people. But then after the pandemic, as ridership fell, they have to spread their fixed costs of operating their network among far fewer riders. And
mind you, at the same time, operating costs have surged.
Right. And at the same time, we've had inflation. Labor costs are up, fuel costs are up, equipment parts for maintenance are up. They say, TriMet says, 54% over the last few years. So the subsidy has gone from under $2 a ride to near $8 now. And that doesn't work. It doesn't pencil. TriMet has, in their words, sort of an operating deficit, structural deficit. And so they need more money if they're going to continue operating the service they are now. Not
only that, I think the other sort of piece here that bears mentioning is we look at the massive public subsidy for TriMet right now, and that has only been magnified or exacerbated by the fact that fare evasion that started during the pandemic just went through the roof. Our colleague Hillary Borrode reported on this, I think, last summer or early fall, when they did some surveys on fare evasion on TriMet, and it was near 30%.
Yeah,
in 2024.
Yeah,
I mean, that's wild.
And,
maybe not New York City wild, but
it measures up. It's high by compared to other regions, and there's a few reasons for that, but it hasn't always been this way. I mean, if you go back to 2016, fare evasion was, by TriMet's numbers, about 15%, and then they stopped tracking it during the pandemic, and then Hillary dug up the figures. They had done a report, they just hadn't publicized it, and Hillary found that it showed that fare evasion had nearly doubled to 27%, and part of it is we have a system where on the max, there's nobody there to take your ticket. There's no turnstile to go through. This was a system that was built literally on the honor system, that you're going to pay and get on. And that's going to help.
And then during the pandemic and afterwards, there was a real stepping back from enforcement on this as well.
Stepping back from enforcement, and probably a cultural shift as well in what people were willing to do and expected to do. And so it's, as I say, it's 27% in the most recent survey of people avoiding fares. So,
but similarly, I think after that came out, and probably even before, TriMet at least has said, and this is true too. Again, as a public transit rider, you see this. They are checking for paid fares much more aggressively than they were a few years ago. They got people on the Max train checking to see if you actually paid to get on.
Now, Shane, you cover the city government, so you know this well. This is a perennial question in Portland, which is the question of whether you should have to pay at all to ride public transit. And there's a significant portion of the political advocacy class that believes you shouldn't have to pay. And so fare enforcement actions are always controversial, as is the fact that TriMet charges anything for the tickets. And so, it's a delicate line for the agency to enforce fares. And it's not entirely clear that fare enforcement would lead to more people paying. It may be that the people who are riding, wouldn't ride at all if it weren't free to them.
Right. Absolutely. But of course, that larger policy question about whether or not public transit should be free ultimately comes down to how do we end up sort of paying for that service. And right now, I mean, I forget. Do you recall exactly when Oregon instituted its statewide transportation improvement fund?
Well,
employee payroll tax, because that's how we started creating sort of a dedicated funding mechanism for TriMet. But it's relatively recent.
It's 2017, and it's a 0.1% payroll tax.
Right.
It isn't just public transit, but that is part of what it funds.
Right. And that becomes sort of the critical question right now during the legislative session, while lawmakers are really digging into, and sort of one of the big ticket items this year is this massive transportation spending bill. And and how much more money is going to be going toward TriMet and public transit. And this becomes sort of the forward-looking issue here, and that TriMet is sending some warning signs about, which is, even with some increases to that fund for TriMet, they're saying they need dramatically more money than the legislature is currently talking about giving them. Otherwise, I mean, we're talking about like apocalyptic cuts to TriMet.
Well, that's TriMet's position. Now, TriMet will tell you right now, as we said, it's a 0.1% payroll tax. The legislative Democrats are talking about increasing that to 0.18%. TriMet describes that as a 0.8% increase, but it's not. It's an 80% increase. It's a huge increase.
Right.
What TriMet wants is increasing it to over a few years, over several years actually, to 0.5%, which is a five-fold increase. That is a huge increase. But what TriMet will say is that absent this, as you said, talking about apocalyptic cuts, I guess your definition of apocalypse may vary. But,
I admit I might have been a tad bombastic there. but as was it G.K. Chesterton? I'm probably the source of this. The source of this I'm going to mangle, but he who fears bombast never rises to eloquence. I mean, that's a great quote. I think it's Chesterton. Anyway, sorry, I interrupted, Mike.
Well, what TriMet says is with the 80% increase in payroll tax that the legislative Democrats are talking about, with that, they would still cut 34 of their 78 bus lines. That's a substantial percentage, but
34 of 78,
and that's 44% by 2027. But that's the beginning. By 2031, they say they would eliminate up to 51 bus lines. So that's 2/3 of all bus lines would be gone. So that would be a much smaller service. And there's so much talk about a doom loop now in terms of bombast. Let's bring out the doom loop. Say the doom loop. If TriMet is less convenient, if it's less reliable, people are going to ride it less. And so if you eliminate 2/3 of your rides, well, it's a lot less convenient, and that feeds on itself. Well, now public transit isn't very useful anymore for a lot of people. So what does that mean? Well, it means fewer people ride it. What does that mean? Well, it has real consequences for those who can't afford an alternative. It also probably means more traffic for the rest of us because there's still 66 million rides a year. Some of those rides wouldn't happen at all without public transit, but some portion of them would go on the roads in other ways. Yeah. So for those of us not riding public transit who are driving around all the time, that means it's more crowded on the roads. This past week, the legislative Republicans unveiled a package that had no transit increases whatsoever. They're the minority party and the super minority party right now. So probably the Republicans won't be getting their way, but is TriMet going to get everything it asks for? Well, this is a state that is feeling really weighed down by its tax burden already. So a big increase is an increase of the kind that TriMet is describing. It is a tough sell.
Well, I think this is certainly an issue that you and I are going to be watching and following in the weeks and months ahead. And perhaps we can reconvene on this podcast at a later date to talk about how things are going in the future.
Well, as you say, Shane, it's a big part of the region's identity. And so it will be top of mind. And the rubber is hitting the road, so to speak, in the next couple weeks on this transportation funding package. And so there will be more light shown on this as the legislature makes its difficult decisions on that front.
Mike Rogoway, thanks so much for chatting with me today.
Yeah, good talking to you, Shane.
Thanks so much for listening to Beat Check with the Oregonian. If you like this show, give us a 5-star rating and review in Apple Podcasts. It really helps people find the show. And tell a friend. Help spread the word. The best way to support our journalism and stories like this one is with a subscription to the Oregonian OregonLive. You can do that at OregonLive.com/podsupport. Until next time.